e-commerce application. In this video, we are going to actually start coding our first CRUD, that is the category CRUD. I'll first of all show you how the category database looks like how the category table looks like. And then what we are going to do, we are going to write some of the CRUD, I would say operation that is mainly going to be for read only, because we have already seen that the end users are not going to be able to create or update or delete a category. They can only read a category. So we are going to write our CRUD operations in the models, in the controllers and in the route, so that we are able to list all the categories, right? Okay, so first of all, let me show you that how the category database looks like, right? So what you can do is you can go to the schema and you can go to the categories, right? And here you can see this, if you are able to see this part of the screen, then here you can see all the things that are there in the categories table. So the columns is one, there is an ID, that's the primary key, then there is the name of the category, that's a varchar, then it's created at and updated at, timestamps are there that when the category was created and when the category was updated. So we are having very simple, I would say, table here with us. And now what we are going to do, we are going to set up our basic CRUD for this category, right? So let's come back to the code editor. Let me close all the windows. And now what we have to do is we have to go to the models, and I'll make a new file, category.js. Right? Okay. So we are going to write the models code so that we are able to fetch the categories from the database, right? So if you will come here and if you will write select star from categories, right? And if you'll try to run this query, okay, database is not selected, so we should do e-commerce db dot categories. Okay, now if you'll try to run this code, you can see a lot of categories are there, right? A lot of categories are already populated. So what we can do is const SQL connection. We need to first fetch the SQL connection, because this SQL connection is only going to help us to actually query our database, right? So we'll go to services / SQL connection, and then we'll do function list categories, right? We'll pass a callback, right? So this function list categories, we are going to actually write our SQL that is going to fetch everything. And then what you can do is module.exports list categories, right? Okay, so what we can do is we can set up our basic SQL. So I will say let SQL is equals to select ID as category ID. We should write it in camel case, category ID, comma, name as name from category, right? From categories. This is going to be our basic SQL, right? For this SQL, we don't need to pass any data, and generally data is passed in form of an array, so this will be an empty array. So what we can do is SQL connection dot execute query. Now you will be able to follow up, I guess. So SQL comma data comma the callback. Now you might be thinking from where this callback is coming. So our models are going to be called by the controllers. So the controllers will be having the actual logic of this callback, which is passed inside the list categories, and this list category internally will pass it to the execute query. So if you will look at execute query, then what will happen is as soon as the query has been executed successfully, the callback function that we are passing is going to be called. Here you can see the callback function that we are passing is going to be called with whatever result and error that we have got, right? Okay, so what we can do is, let's say instead of passing this callback directly here, we'll say function, right, error comma result, and then we can say callback of error comma result, right? So this function, we can directly also pass the callback, but we have wrapped it inside this function, which is going to internally call this callback. This callback on line number 7 is going to be passed from the controller, and this whole callback here you can see is the callback that we have passed inside the execute query, like this. Okay, So this is going to be the basic setup for the models for us, right? So actually what is there in the models? If I try to concrete my thought, then inside models we write our business logic. So what's our business logic? In this feature we want to list everything from the category. In the category DB, if you will look at, then you have an ID and the name, which is the most important thing for us. So what we have done is we have written a function list categories. Inside the list categories we have a SQL. This SQL is actually going to the prod and going to be executed, right? Then this is the data. Sometimes we have to feed user input data, so we will be using this array. In the further subsequent, I would say, model implementations, you'll be seeing more usage of this data. But for a simple read in the list, in the categories, we don't want this data to be populated anyway. And then we are going to use the SQL connection dot execute query. This execute query function is coming from the configuration that we set up for our SQL connection. This execute query actually takes your SQL, actually takes your data and make it execute on the SQL server, whether it's on your local host or it's somewhere on any other cloud database. So we are going to pass our SQL, we are going to pass our data. Apart from that, we are going to pass this function as well. Here you can see this is the function. This is the function that we are passing. This function is going to be passed as this callback function. So whenever we have successfully executed our query, I'm going to call this callback function error and result. So this error 1 and result will be coming as the parameter here. And we are going to call this callback, which is coming from this argument in line number 3. And this callback is going to be passed by my controller. So this is the most important thing. Every time from your model, you're going to make from your controller, you are going to make a call to your model. From your model, you're going to call the database, fetch the result back in the model, and the model is going to fetch the result back in the controller. So now I believe you are able to understand that the next step that we have to do is write a new file for category controller.js. So this is going to be the controller for the category. So first of all, I need to fetch my category model is equals to require models slash category, right? Module.exports. I will say list categories. I'll write a function here also. Function list categories. Okay. And here the function is going to be very special. Why? Because this function is going to take a request parameter and a response parameter. You might be thinking, how do we know that the function is going to take a request and a response parameter? Then that is going to be really very easy. Why? Because in the index.js here also you can see this is actually a controller only, nothing else. This is actually a controller. Like this complete function is a controller, where this part is coming from the routes and this is the actual controller callback. So here you can see it is going to take request and response. So you might be thinking where our route part is. So that we are going to separately write inside the routes and we will connect them there. Right. So first of all, let's write the logic for the controller callback with the request and the response parameter. So I will say category dot list categories. This is the list categories function that we are calling from the model. Inside the list categories, we are expecting a callback. So I'll pass a callback, error comma result. Right. If there is an error, then what we are going to do, we'll do console.log error. We are going to log the error so that we will be able to debug it if there is any issue. Then we are going to say return res dot status 500. Why we are going to set up the status as 500? Because there was some server side error that would have happened. That's why we are not able to fetch the categories from the MySQL database. So we'll set up the response code as 500 and we'll say send, and inside the send we are going to say message as error in fetching the categories, and we are also going to say success is false, and that's it. Right. So this will be the part when there will be an error while executing the query. If there is no error while executing the query, then we can directly say return res.status 200. Now because the query has been successfully sent, we'll set up the error code as 200 and we'll say dot send message successfully fetched the categories. You can write any message, whatever your front end expects. Then inside, then we will be having one parameter of success as true, and then we'll be having one more parameter of categories, which will be sending all the result, right? So this is going to be the controller for us. So let me repeat this thing. What the controller is going to do, whenever you hit the route, controller is going to be the first line of defense. When I say first line of defense, then I mean that controller is going to be the first one that is going to take up the request and actually do some action on it. So when the controller is going to take this request, all the parameters, headers, everything from the request, from the HTTP request is going to come inside this request parameter, and whatever details and whatever things that you have to modify for the response, you will do with this response parameter. Then what you are going to do, you are going to call your model. Here you can see category.list categories is actually calling the model. If the model was not able to query the database, or there was some error, whatever it is, we'll have this error parameter field, and what we'll do, we'll return a 500, that is the internal server error status code, right? And we'll say error in fetching the categories. Otherwise, if there is no error, what we are going to do, we are going to actually set up the status as 200, and we'll say we are able to successfully fetch the categories. Now all we have to do is, on what kind of route we should hit this controller. Now we need to set up our routes. Setting up of the routes means that whenever the user is going to call, let's say localhost 3000 slash, after slash, what will be the actual URL that is going to be called when this controller function should be hit. So what we can say is, let's come to the routes folder. Inside the routes, we have the API and we have the V1, right? So what you can do is, you can come inside the APIs folder. Here you can come, and inside the APIs, because let's say we can have multiple APIs, right? This is something that is very common, that sometimes you have the version 1 of the API, sometimes you have version 2 of the APIs, and you migrate, so on and so forth. So what we can say is, let's say inside the API folder, what we are going to do, we are going to set up a index.js, right? This is going to be the initial part of the route, and here we are going to set up basic route. So const express is equals to require express, right? And then what we are going to do, we are going to use the express router. So let router is equals to express dot router. We'll set up the express router. This is going to help us in the whole routing mechanism, and we'll say router dot use slash v1, and we will say let's say this thing, that const v1 router is equals to require. What we are going to do, we are going to actually set up a v1 router. I'll show you how, but first of all, let's pass this v1 router here, and we'll do module dot exports is equals to router, right? Now what you have to do is, you have to go to the v1 folder and make another index.js. So inside the v1 folder, new file, index.js. Inside this index.js, we are going to actually write our routes, right? So we'll say const express is equals to require express, right? And we'll say const category controller is equals to, we are going to require the category controller. So where is our category controller? We'll go one folder back, we'll go another folder back, we'll go another folder back. Then inside source, we'll go to controllers and then category controller. This will fetch us the category controller. And now what you can say is, we need to set up a express router. So let router is equals to express dot router, and we'll say router dot get. We'll set up a get request, right? Slash category slash all, and then what you are going to do, we are going to call category controller dot list categories. So now you can see we have set up a route, and then the corresponding controller is there, that is going to be called as the callback, and then you can do module dot exports is equals to router. Now what we are going to do, we are going to require this router here. So slash API slash V1 slash index, right? So this is going to be the V1 router for us. So what actually is happening? Now we will say that all the routes that we are going to have in this V1 router, they are going to be prepended by this slash V1. So whenever we'll be calling localhost slash API slash V1 slash category slash all. This is going to be the overall, I would say, routing mechanism that we are going to follow, right? Okay, so I believe this thing is set up. This thing is successfully set up. Now what we can do is we can come to our source, or let's say index.js, and here we have to fetch the route, right? Here we have to fetch the route. So we will say const, I will say API router is equals to require, I would say dot slash route slash API. Okay, and what we can do is, as soon as we have the API router, this thing, let's keep it as it is, and then what we can do is we can say app.use slash API. Now, as I said, the URL is going to be localhost 3000 slash API. Whenever slash API as the URL will come, then you are going to call API router. This is something that we are going to do. Okay. So now let's just try to run our application, right? So let's say we'll say index.js. Okay, so there is some error. So let's see what the error says. It says that express.router is not a function. Okay, let us check. Okay, where we are using it. Express. Okay, so here you can also see router does not exist. Did you mean router? So this should be capital R. Sorry, my bad. And here I believe also there should be the same thing. Yes, the router. And now if you will try to run the code, here you can see the server has started successfully. Now what you have to do, you have to open Postman, right? I've already opened Postman here, right? What you have to do, you have to go to new and you have to make an HTTP request. So you can select this HTTP request. First of all, here you can see, let's see the UI for Postman. So here you can see this is the get request. So you are able to see all the get request and everything. This is the URL bar where you will be actually writing the URL. There are some params. These are the query params if you want to add in the URL. Some headers if you want to add in the URL. If you want to add a body in your URL, then you can also do that. So all of these features are available. So what we can do is, just a moment. Okay. So let's say we'll write our URL, localhost 3000 slash API slash V1 slash category slash all, right? If you'll try to send it, here you can see we are able to successfully fetch all the categories. All the categories from the database are getting listed here. So this is going to be a great achievement for us, and this is going to be a, I would say, great step forward while writing our APIs. So actually you have written your first API, right? Now I'm going to tell you the detailed flow of how exactly everything works. Then we are going to go through all the code once again and we'll see what exactly we have done. Okay, so now let's just see that how exactly the whole architecture is working. So here we have our client, right? In our case, this client is going to be Postman. But if you have a front-end team or you are also developing the front-end, this client will be your corresponding front-end. What this client actually does is, it actually raises an HTTP request to the server, right? This is our server, which is actually our node application, right? If you want to see how we are sending the HTTP request, here you can see whenever you do a send, right, then you are sending a new HTTP request, right? On the server, actually what happens is, it processes the query somehow, it processes the request somehow, and then it is going to send back an HTTP response. right? This is going to send back an HTTP response. You can see this is the HTTP response that we are getting. Now what exactly happens is, inside the server, if you will carefully look, inside the server, what happens is, there are three layers, which is actually models, controllers, and we also used to have views, but for the timing we are not having any dedicated views. So for the timing I'll only show two circles of model and controller. So this is controller, this is model. Now what happens is that whenever the client makes an HTTP request, this HTTP request is made for a URL. You can see that we have added a URL here. So this URL is called as a route. Makes the request on a route, right? So whenever server receives the fact that okay, a new request has come on a route, for example /API/v1, I'll tell you how this whole /API/v1 hierarchy is going on. /category/all. So we can say that as soon as the server receives a new request on this route, the server tries to fetch that okay, for this route which controller is assigned. As soon as the server finds that okay, for this route this controller is assigned, it makes a request to this controller, and there are two parameters that it takes: request and response. This request is going to have all the details of the HTTP request that the client is making, and this response is going to be storing all the response details that eventually the server is going to give back to the client. So this is the request response that the server passes to the controller. Now the controller has to do the task that the controller actually interacts with the model. The model internally interacts with our database. The database is going to give model some result back. Model is going to read the data, manipulate the data, and then model is going to give back the data to the controller, and eventually controller is going to give back the data to the server, and the server actually returns the HTTP response. This is how the whole architecture works. In this whole architecture we have skipped views because we are writing an API driven application. Otherwise there will be a layer of views where the controller is going to give back the data to the views. But here in our case, what is happening is controller is just the first line of defense. It's a notion that controller should be thin, models can be thick. That means the whole business logic goes inside the model. I can write it here. The business logic goes inside the model. How the data should look like when you are sending it in the response, that thing can be derived in the controller. The database is going to store all the data that we are having inside our application. So this is how the whole structure works. Again, I'm repeating. First of all, you make an HTTP request to the server. Server receives the request. Every request is made for a route or a URL. Server sees that for this URL, which controller is assigned. So server reaches out to that controller with the request and the response. Like request is already sent by the client. Response the server is building. So this response object is that response object that the server is building. Then inside the controller sees that okay, I have received a request. I have a logic. Inside my logic, I'm going to call a model. There is no certainty that every time you are going to call a model, but if you are having some business logic, then definitely you will call a model. So we'll call this model. Model is going to eventually call the database if it wants. It will receive the data back from the database. It will manipulate the data, give back the data to the controller. Controller will see that how the response should look like the status code, error message, success message, etc. And the controller is going to give back the request to the server, which eventually goes back to the client as the HTTP response. So all of this thing is happening on the HTTP protocol. Now, if we go back to our coding implementation, then let's see step by step exactly where we have done everything. Okay. So, first of all, let's see the routes. Inside the routes folder, here you can see inside the routes, I have API. So, how the folder looks like? Inside the routes, I have a folder API. Inside API, I have a folder V1. So, how exactly this thing is managed is, sometimes you will be having some API based route that is going to give you just the response, not any views. Sometimes it can be non-API routes as well. So inside my routes folder, I have two kind of routes: non-API routes and API routes. What is API? API is application package interface. So this API is going to expose a lot of our backend features and functionality to the end user. Now the thing is, we can have multiple versions of the API as well. Right, let's say we initially started building the API where we are just exposing things not in a very efficient manner, but later we optimized our APIs and updated it to some more efficient algorithms, right? So what we do is we maintain multiple versions of the API because some end users might be still using our V1 API, so we can't just directly discard it. We have to maintain it for some time, then we completely migrate to V2 and so on and so forth. That's why we have this folder V1. Now whenever we are going to make a request, the request looks like this. Initially, what is your base URL? It is localhost 3000. 3000 is the port. It's the port slash. Now after slash, whatever we will write is going to be our route. So slash API. So this first, I would say, section is going to tell that we are going to make a call to an API. Then V1 version of the API. And then what is the API? Category slash all. So this is the actual API route. This is the version. Right. So let's see what happens. Inside my, whenever I will make a request, so like whenever the client makes an HTTP request, we receive inside our Node app. What is the first file that gets hit when we actually run the Node app? Yes, you are right. It is the index.js. This index.js file is going to get the request first. So we will say that we will add a middleware. How do we add a middleware in our Express application? Using use. We will say that app.use /API /API router. We will say that any request, no matter what, but any request that starts with localhost 3000 /API. /API is the prefix of the route. Any request that comes with this prefix should be mapped with API router. You will say, okay, that makes sense. What is API router? API router is defined in /route /API folder. Here you can see inside API folder. If you will go inside API router, this is API router. This is inside /route /API. There is a folder V1 and corresponding to the folder V1 we have this index.js. Now we can have multiple versions, right? So we can make V1 router, V2 router, V3 router. So we will say that now every request that starts with /API is going to come to this route. Now every route that after /API starts with /V1 should go to V1 router. Okay, where V1 router is defined, it's defined inside the V1 folder. We will go to V1 router. We are here. Now what we will say that now exactly after /V1, anything that starts with /category /all should be mapped with category controller.list categories. So we are first fetching the category controller. How we are fetching? We have to go back outside few folders, and then inside source controller, category controller, we have our whole implementation of category controller. We'll see category controller in some moment. We have also fetched our Express package. We made a router because wherever you have to make a router logic, you have to get Express router. And we'll say we will expect a get request. We will always expect a get request on /API /V1 /category /all. And whenever we will get a get request, we are going to map this get request to the controller, category controller.list categories, and we are going to export this. Right. So one more thing that I can show you is if you will change the request to post and send it, here you can see cannot post. It is not able to find the corresponding API. But if you will again convert it to get, you are again able to successfully fetch the API. Now we need to see what is there in the controller. So as I said, now the server has received the request for a corresponding route. The server will see that for this route, this is the controller. So we will go inside the controller. Inside the controller, we will be having the logic where we will be manipulating the request, creating our response, calling the model, etc. So see, we are first of all fetching the model from model /category. We are saying inside the list categories function, there will be a request and a response. We are not having much use case for request parameter in list categories, but later we'll be having it when we'll be passing some data from the URL. So we'll call this model category.list category. This is the model function call. Which says that we are going to pass a callback. The model function expects just a callback. I can show you that as well. So here you can see this list category just expects a callback. We will say that when the category model has been executed and due to any reason there was some error due to which model function was not able to complete its task, we will be having this error variable field. We'll say if there is any error, we'll first of all print the error. So what you can say is, let's say if you go to the terminal, right, then we'll be able to print the error here, right? Okay. Apart from that, we will say that rest.status 500, that return a status 500, that is internal server error. Whenever you get a error which is caused by internal server logic, because model is core server logic, it's not due to the end user. There was no issue with the end user's request, because end user's request was correct. That's why we were able to map it with the controller. If you are not able to map it with any controller, then there is some issue with the end user's request. But end user's request is perfectly fine. That's why we have internal server error. So status code 500, and then send message success. Inside message you can write any message and success is false. If there was no error, then this if check will not be executed, and we are just going to return status 200, that is okay, that the request has been fetched successfully. And then we'll do dot send and a JSON response. We'll write a message, we'll do success true, and inside categories parameter we'll be having a result, right? This result is going to be fetched by the SQL query. Now let's see how the query looks like. If we'll go to list categories, now here you can see we have fetched the SQL connection, right? This SQL connection is actually going to set up a connection with the server. As soon as the server connection is set up, it will execute the query as well. So inside list categories function, I have written my SQL query that I want to actually run on the server. Then there is a data property. Then there is SQL connection.execute. This function of execute query is actually going to execute the query. It will take the SQL, it will take the data that is going to be passed in the SQL. Here we have empty data, and then it will take a callback function. Whatever is the result of this callback function, we are going to internally call the callback function coming from the controller. So let's see how SQL connection looks like. Inside SQL connection, I have created some configuration, some backend configuration that is helping me to connect to the re-level database. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to set up this pool, right? This pool is going to have all the configurations of the MySQL so that we can set up a connection with the MySQL server on the cloud. Then I'll be writing a function execute query. It takes the SQL, the data, and a callback. We'll first try to set up the connection. If we are not able to set up the connection, then there will be this error variable. This error variable will be fetched, and we'll just call the callback with error. If the connection is set up successfully, then we will do connection.query. This is going to actually execute the query. Which query? This SQL query, which is a string. It will pass the data inside the SQL query, and it's going to call this callback function, right? Inside the callback function, again we have error and result. Now let's say there was some issue in the query only. Connection setup was good, execution was good, but the query that we wrote was wrong or maybe not viable. Then also we can have an error. If we got an error, we'll again call the callback. Otherwise, this query has been successfully completed. We will close the database connection that we have set up with the prod, and then we are going to execute the callback with the error, which is going to be obviously empty, and the result that is going to store all the, I would say, categories for us. And here you can see this result is actually what? An array of objects, because we are going to have multiple categories. So this is the whole flow that goes behind the scenes whenever we are making an API call. This diagram that we have made here, is going to be very helpful for you guys to understand exactly how things work and what exactly goes behind the scenes whenever you are making a new API. Every time we have to just follow the same mechanism. We'll be having a route, we'll be mapping it with a controller. Inside the controller, we'll be mapping the request response with a model. Inside the model, we'll be having some queries, some business logic that we will execute on the database. Database will give us the response to the model. Model will give response to controller. Controller will respond to server, and server will give response to the client. That's it, right? The only thing that you have to take care about is the first file that we are going to execute is index.js. So every time you can start mapping, okay, which call is going where, and you can start using this thing. One very small piece of information is this is a middleware. What is a middleware? Middleware are those functions that are going to be called in between any function call, right? So this middleware use says that whenever you get any request that starts with a given string, call this callback function. This is the only use case of this. You can read more about how exactly app.use works, right? You can read more about its use case. But the best part about this session was we were able to write our first API, and that too so fast and so cleanly, right? You are able to fetch it, you are able to use the postman, server is working fine, everything is going good. Now in the upcoming lectures, what we are going to do, we are going to build more features around it. We are going to see that what other features we can add. We are going to see different type of request going and coming back, so on and so forth. So that being said, we will meet up in the next video. Till then, take care guys, bye bye, and thank you.
अरे को दिन हाजिर नहीं होला